thank you all for joining us. I'm very excited about today and about talking about research impact, which I think is a really important topic, which is why we're doing these public squares, why we started this program, really is because we want to take the benefits of our research beyond the academic context into the real world to benefit more people. So, and that includes policy making and policy engagements, community engagements, and all these different topics we've been unpacking over the last few months. So today I'm very excited to introduce Heide Hackmann. Heidi joined Stellenbosch University in July at Crest, and 2 years before that she joined Future Africa Institute. Is that in Johannesburg? Pretoria. And before that, her whole research career was all around impactful research and working at the International Scientific Policy Council. Yeah, so that she's going to bring all this real-world knowledge to our groups, and I'm really grateful that she could join us today. So I won't wait any longer. I'll hand over to Heidi, and thank you.
Thank you, Astrid. Hi, everyone, and hello to those of you online. So maybe just to add to what Astrid has said by way of introduction, I'm actually not a researcher. My career has been in international science policy making, science diplomacy, and science advice. I was CEO of the International Science Council, which is a global representative body of members from 140 countries around the world. In consultative status with the UN, with UNESCO, etc. So in South Africa, the membership comes from the National Research Foundation and the Human Sciences Research Council, for example. So the story I want to share with you today takes a really big picture view on the issue of impact. Not just the impact of research, but also the impact of today's global context in which science operates on scientific institutions, on scientific practice. So it kind of starts at a very high level, and then I will try to come back to what does that mean for research today, what challenges does that raise?
100%.
So I'm going to look first of all at what do we mean by today's global societal context. But what is the dominant framing if we talk global context for science? You want to reduce that?
It's all implicit. Can I squeeze it there?
Sure. And look at what the implications have been of that context for and the responses by the global scientific community. Then I want to go back and take a reality check on the current context. So questioning that dominant framing that we use when we talk about science in today's challenging world. And then based on that reality check, just pose some of the questions that I think we need to ask ourselves, and these are the questions that I want to address as part of my research chair now here at Crest, and then give some thoughts on possible ways forward. So let's look at the dominant framing. An age of complexity, of interlinked global challenges. I think that is a really good starting point, and it introduced the framing that I think all universities today focus on, and that's the 2030 agenda. So the 17 Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by all UN member states in September 2015. Science had a big role to play in the development of those goals, on commenting on various drafts. But you can imagine what a complex process that was. And they were launched, I think, at a time of real optimism and hope as a universal, indivisible agenda around which we can all rally. Not just, the Millennium Development Goals were about development and the Global South, developing countries. And the Sustainable Development Goals were launched as this universal new world order. Hiding complex set of goals, interlinked, as I said, indivisible, so we had to look at all these issues as a package for all countries. A powerful framing narrative. We've seen institutional policies, strategies, new initiatives emerging in response, and what we've also seen is existing strategies and policies and institutions reframing themselves around this. And this goes for science and many other sectors. We've also seen people using the SDGs as a basis, a framework for exploring new collaborations. From within the world of science, I think the best example was that with this common agenda, we could start talking to different kinds of funders and say, you're all supporting this, why don't we do it together? So for example, because of the SDGs at the International Science Council, we were able to get national funding agencies, international donor agencies, philanthropists, private foundations to start thinking about collaborative funding. Because they had a common, they didn't have to debate the vision. They didn't have to debate the agenda. Very powerful agenda. And what you see in Africa at a very generic level, this comes from a recent document on STI, Science, Technology and Innovation, in Sub-Saharan Africa, is that you see obviously strong alignment between the Agenda 2030 and the African Union's Agenda 2063. And what I think is interesting is that all these little blue, yellow, and green marks show across the continent how, at a governmental level, at a policy level, the response to the SDGs has been taken seriously. This refers to, task forces, parliamentary committees, specifically targeting the SDGs. So it's had impact as a global framework, at least we know, on the policy environment. And that's the policy environment that we work in if we talk about research impact. So I think it's relevant to take note of the extent of this response. I think what we must also remember, we tend to focus very much on the Sustainable Development Goals, but there is a prevalence now within the multilateral system of so-called global frameworks. And all of them make demands on national policy makers, and all of them make demands on scientific communities. The one that we obviously most often don't forget is the climate agreement, the Paris Agreement. But here are just examples of other global frameworks that have also come with indicators and are universal and highly complex. The Human Development Index, that's been ongoing for a very long time, run by UNDP. Countries have to measure themselves against indicators. The Disaster Risk Reduction Framework, also a global goal. Hello, Michael. The very new Global Biodiversity Framework, the One Health approach, the Emerging Planetary Health approach, and then the UN Secretary General's Roadmap for Digital Cooperation. And as I say, all of these function as frameworks with goals, indicators, expectations of governments to implement and monitor. And I just think we must remember this multiplicity of global goals. And we'll come back to that in our reality check. So that's the dominant framing. Science for the SDGs. That's been my life for the last decade. What are the implications of this, and what kind of responses have we seen from science communities? So by science, I'm using it in the German Wissenschaft way. I refer to all sciences, social and human sciences included. So I've mentioned some of the implications, but let's look at this. First of all, I think it's really interesting to note that within the multilateral system, within the UN system, there has been a strengthened mandate for science because of the SDGs. So prior to 2015, the only way in which scientists from anywhere in the world could comment on or contribute to UN policy making is through a system that the UN has used for decades called the major group system. They have a major group for science and technology, they have a major group for farmers, they have a major group for the youth, etc., etc., etc. And the International Science Council managed the major group for science and technologies. And so we would, if there was, like in the development of the SDGs, we would send out calls for input to our global community. What do you think? What advice? And then we would issue advice to the UN. And as a major group lead, we could speak at the UN, but for 2 minutes. That was the mandate, essentially. I'm simplifying it, but the UN system is a complex one. What we see after the launch of the SDGs is member states unanimously set up what they call a technology facilitation mechanism. And this consisted of 3 things. One, a 10-member group, which was an advisory group from science, civil society, and the private sector. That group advised the UN on matters of STI on SDG. It still does. And it was supported by by an interagency task team on STI, focusing on STI for the SDGs, involving today all UN entities. That's quite something. So it's not just UNESCO, which has the competency for science in the UN system. It's UNDP, it's UNEP, it's UNIDO, etc., etc. And alongside that, there is now an annual multi-stakeholder forum focusing on the role of STI for SDGs, and it meets just before the high-level political forum, which is an annual event where member states come together to review their progress on the SDGs, and the outcomes of the STI forum get fed into that high-level political forum. That's pretty powerful stuff. It means you don't need an international scientific council to come and speak for 2 minutes. It means there's a space for science to view its advice or its opinions, its advice. At the same time, you have, and these are the diagrams here on the right, you have since 2015 a regular Global Sustainable Development Report, which is prepared by a group of 15 international scientists that are nominated by member states and then appointed by the UN Secretary General. And the first one was 2015, and the latest one came out just ended last year. And at the same time, you have, at the UN level, advising the Secretary General, a scientific advisory board, also new, and now what they call a science and action group, which member states in New York have actually launched. So huge strengthening of visibility for and then therefore a valuing of the voice of science in global policy making. I think that's impact at the global level. And we're all part of that. You know, when we talk about science, it's individual scientists who go to those fora and speak. So we're all part of that. And yes, please.
Sharing these slides with us.
Absolutely fine. Absolutely. Yeah. Astrid will share them, right?
Yes.
So this is just to show that, of course, everybody, you know, there's been it's not just the reports at the global level, but there's a huge focus also on the continent about taking stock of STI for SDGs. The very first, I think, and really the very good edited volume on this was by Manu Ramatsundela and David Mikler, called Africa and the Sustainable Development Goals. But here you see, I mean, just last year, 3 reports from the European Commission, from the UN, UNECA, the UN Economic Council for Africa, UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs in New York, all focusing on science for SDGs in Africa. Let me not go into detail, but let's just say and think about Stellenbosch. Universities have rallied around the SDG framework. Today, our impact ambitions, the approaches, is all about how do we make a difference to sustainable development. We use it as reporting frameworks. At times, higher education uses it to rank universities. And it frames a lot of the continental initiatives we see. If you think about later on this month, Stellenbosch is hosting the Arua EU Guild Clusters of Excellence, the new Clusters of Excellence. If you look at the topics, I mean, you can slot them into the SDG boxes, right? It's funding. I'll come back to funding. Academies is the same. We're not here at an academy, but suffice it to say that the SDGs have also been used as a driver at an international level to build the capacity of academies to advise policymakers, and the focus is on science for SDGs. If you look at funders, their strategies are relevant. They've also, shifted to the SDGs. If you look at the regional networks of funders, like the African Science Granting Council's initiative, you see their collaborative work where they try and work together. Huge focus on SDGs. The International Science Council, as I mentioned earlier, has convened what they call a global forum of funders. And it was the SDG framework that allowed us to do that as a common agenda. That has actually led to a recent call for mission-oriented sustainability science projects. Interesting, very transdisciplinary. We'll get back to that. And then, of course, AU, multilateral, World Bank, whatever funding, you see this alignment. So these are all stories of impact on the science system. And then many other initiatives. UNESCO has an environmental humanities initiative called Bridges that's hosted. There's an Africa Hub hosted at Pretoria. Future Earth, which is a global sustainability science program network, now has a leadership center hosted by the University of Rhodes and Pretoria, funded by the National Research Foundation. There's the SDSN that operates throughout the continent, those clusters of excellence, etc., etc. We've all rallied around SDGs in ways that it's hard to compare. It's unprecedented, really, if you think about the history of science. So here then, those are the sort of impacts at an institutional, strategic level. But I think it's also interesting for us to consider how this story of development reflects shifting policy imperatives and conceptualization in science. Simplified, but I think they are important. When I first joined the world of international councils, the strapline for what was then called the International Council for Scientific Unions was science for the benefit of society. Today, we don't talk about science for society, we talk about science with society. And now we're even debating, the most recent debate I heard about a few weeks ago was, should we be talking about science in society? This might seem silly to you, but it shows how our conceptions have changed, and it has relevance to what I think you guys are doing in your Public Squares project. We used to talk about relevance. Now we talk about impact, regardless of whether we have a common understanding of what that means. But we don't talk about relevance anymore, talk about impact. We used to talk about the impact or the relevance of science in a very linear way. Now, a bit like a cannon shooting a bullet, and then it lands, boom, and it has impact, but linear. Now we talk about iterative processes and the complexity of policy making and the feedback loops. And therefore, we used to talk about science as the solution, and now it's science as part of the solution. It's part of that iterative process. Science policy interface. Today, you get criticized if you don't say practice, science policy practice interface. And ultimately, and this comes to, probably the Project Squares thing more clearly, we've shifted, we've had 8 decades of talking about the need for interdisciplinarity. We've almost forgotten that, and now we're talking about transdisciplinarity. And these shifts are all aligned. And when we talk about impact today, we do, I think, tend to say, and the way forward is transdisciplinarity. Again, I'm generalizing, but as an approach, engagement, etc., etc. If you want impact, if you want science for SDGs funding, you have to be transdisciplinary. Future Africa was set up as a platform, a Pan-African platform, to fund, to promote, advocate, and support transdisciplinarity to meet sustainable development goals. That's big stuff. Talking millions of rounds of investment. Now, I don't want to go into a lesson on transdisciplinarity, but it is perhaps because there's such confusion, and I don't know if this is in your experience still, it's perhaps just useful to go through 1 or 2 slides on what I mean by it, right? And I think it's a kind of generic conversation. What I do find interesting is that the concept first emerged not in the domain of applied science, environmental science, or whatever the case may be, but in science studies, the science of science. That's where it emerged. And this is a science of science policy issue that I'm talking about. And it's only from the 1990s that it started becoming much more clearly linked with global environmental change, public health, and what we today call sustainability science. Today, if I look at some university policies, it's supposed to be for all science. And that is what makes it challenging, I think, very challenging as a university strategy. We call it by different names. Some of these names are old, like Mode 2, participatory research. Some of them are new, like mission-oriented science, or whatever I heard recently, community science. A lot of people still confuse transdisciplinarity with citizen science. And I think that's an interesting one because it doesn't touch on what I think transdisciplinarity, or TD, as we say, the fundamental elements of it is. In citizen science, you have citizens who are providing scientists with data, but they are not necessarily part of co-designing projects or co-generating knowledge. And it's not always focused on producing actionable knowledge that you can use in an applied context. And that's why I say, for me, TD is a purposeful approach. It has to be about a problem, about an issue in context. Critically, the part in transdisciplinarity, you are looking at different types of knowledge, and you're saying they're all valid, they all have something to contribute. So your societal partners are knowledge partners. They are not passive providers of data or passive users of results. They are part of the knowledge generation process. And again, it's context-specific, problem-oriented, and very often a very powerful technique for not just the complexity of challenges, but a lot of those challenges are contested challenges where we don't have agreement on possible solutions. We have differences in values, differences in perceptions. So for me, that's what I mean by TD. And of course, I'm not going to go through this, but there is an interesting recent volume that's come out, edited by Roderick Lawrence. I just wanted to share that with you. It's really a valuable book, and also lovely case studies of both the perceived potential of TD, the perceived impact, actual examples, and then some of the impediments. We don't need to go through this, right, in detail. You're TD expert. Okay? Okay, good. All right, I find the impediments interesting. I mean, from a policy maker, apart from things like the TD projects I look at, it's wonderful you have representatives of different sectors, but you think, have you got the right people around the table? Do those people have voice? And then more institutionally, I mean, look at the competition between universities in our country alone. Competition and collaboration are the point of tension and transdisciplinarity is about deep, meaningful collaboration. And then, it goes all the way through to the resources, and typical grant period and amount doesn't allow you to put together the trusted partnerships you need in a TD environment, and it certainly doesn't allow you to come up with any meaningful results. So if you have money for 2 years, it's hard to do deep transdisciplinary work that leads to demonstrable, measurable impact or changes in the world. Okay, so there's the dominant framing. Global sustainable development has had a huge impact on the science system everywhere in the world. And it links nicely with sort of developments in the history of our conceptions of science, its role in society, how we understand the notion of relevance or impact. And this has led us to today being, with transdisciplinarity as the kind of dominant go-to approach if we want to do impactful policy, relevant, public action, relevant research. I think that simply is my story up to now. So the question then is, how much progress have we made? What's happened, right? In 2022, there was a report by what they call the Global Goals Project. And again, I'll share these slides, but basically they're saying nothing's changed, but everyone's talking about it. And everyone, as I've shown you in Africa as well, is setting up committees and structures and strategies. So it's been a very powerful framing narrative, but in terms of actual major new programs where you can show that change has happened, that we've made progress on achieving those goals, very little. And this is then reflected in the most recent Global Sustainable Development Report called, aptly, I think, Times of Crisis, Times of Change. They are showing, and it's worth looking at these reports, even the one before made the same, but they've all made the same point, that the progress we've made across the world is patchy and often very symbolic, like the Global Goals Report says. In terms of all the 17 SDGs, they can show some progress, very slow implementation progress on only 3 since 2020, and actually crisis-induced regress. Clearly, we're talking about a global pandemic here on most of the others, or on 7, and stagnation on the others. So what the UN is saying, and this is language that comes directly from the Secretary General, is we need urgent course corrections, okay, and acceleration. And we know we are now talking about existential threats, etc. So that really, that time of hope, our new world order in September 2015, we're a very different mood today. In addition to being off track on just the one set of global goals, the SDGs, we are now talking about humanity being on the precipice of a polycrisis. So where multiple crises come together and interact. Okay, there's a nice talk, a very recent talk by the economist Ha Yun Chang in Oxford about how this is all nonsense and we've always been in polycrisis. But this is the language we're talking of. Just, the May 2024 STI Forum, I was in New York, I had a speaking slot, and I tell you, we are talking about polycrisis. The world in, this cascading systemic risk, and you see what comes up in all the risk reports as the obvious ones, starting with war and new nuclear threats. So at the same time, and this is where that point about multiple global frameworks comes back. How are we responding to the polycrisis? I think in a way that is polycentric. So every global framework has its own advisory board, it has its own programs, it has its own funding, it has its own UN agency, it has a siloed, polycentric. We deal with climate, we deal with biodiversity, we deal with sustainable development, we deal with digital cooperation separately, and we deal with global security separately. So I think that's a problem. We know that the multilateral system has major failures. You just need to look at, the power of the International Court of Justice. You need to look at implementation of the Paris Climate Agreement. So failures at the multilateral system, and at the same time, we can't ignore growing threats to scientific understanding and interpretation. In a world where we're dealing with mis and disinformation, in a world that is a data-driven world where a lot of people feel they've got access to the information, and that is knowledge. But, so the idea that data is not knowledge is something we as scientists advocate, but for many people that's irrelevant, and they just think they have access to the data, AI can solve the problem. So this for me is it's not just the hopeful new world order, it's a world of crisis. And I'm not sure about the polycrisis and where I stand on that, but I do find it's a very different climate for science to what we had in 2015. And let me just say that, I'll come back to that on the questions for science. Let me just say that now, next week, the Summit for the Future starts. This is Antonio Guterres' legacy. There's going to be a pact for the future, and one has to remain hopeful. It's the one thing, if you've worked in the UN, when you walk into the General Assembly or the Security Council, then you kind of feel this zone of hope, because this is where influential people come together and make agreements. So we have to remain hopeful. And what is interesting, the zero draft of the Pact for the Future, which is prepared by member states, by the way. But again, scientists comment on it and other communities. They do acknowledge, obviously, the crisis. They commit to delivering collaboratively, so that addressing these governance issues, multilateralism, and pledging a new beginning, and also, again, underscoring the necessary role of knowledge, science. Okay, so we're back there, and interestingly, they don't deal with these multiple global frameworks. It is very much about the Agenda 2030. It's still about SDGs. But anyway, it's hopeful. So that's the reality check for me. And now we are looking at course corrections. What can we do? As a scientific community, we have to ask ourselves that. And I think more importantly, those course corrections, all those reports I've showed you, they all say what we need is urgent social transformation. So it's no longer good enough to provide a solution to a problem. That solution has to lead to some form of profound systems change, where we address issues from values and attitudes to institutional structures that maintain our unsustainable lifestyles and cause the problems we're focusing on in the first place. So transformation, whatever course corrections we follow, transformations is now the common goal. I would say personally that, as I say, you read this in every document. I think there's very little understanding of what we mean by transformation, how we recognize it when it happens, what drives it, what is socially acceptable, politically and culturally acceptable, about making change, such profound change happen. We have very little understanding, but there is a lot of knowledge about this on the social science side. The questions for me that in this new reality check context arise, and I call them first order questions because each one can be broken down into many different questions and research projects. I think we're at a stage where we do need to rethink, particularly in Africa, what the role of science in society is. In other words, what do we want that role to be? What are expectations of science? And based on that, what do we mean by impact? I think we're all over the place. We are solutions, technically focused on solutions, and actually even older on economic growth. You can challenge us on this. But I think there's a broader need now for us to say, look at this response in Africa and the rest of the world to a global set of ambitions. And yet we can show no progress. Clearly we're failing somewhere. Should we not also rethink what that role of science actually is? We used to, especially as social scientists, we used to be proud of criticizing policy. Today we have to serve policy. I'm just putting it out there to stimulate thinking, right? So that's one big question. These are all related. We need to understand transformation. And we need to understand as a scientific community, first of all, is transdisciplinary a silver bullet? Is the fact that you engage in co-generation of knowledge with societal stakeholders, is that going to solve the problem? Is that going to lead to social transformation? Or is there something else we need to do? How can science best inform and support processes of profound systems change? And that leads, of course, to asking the question about, have we really explored innovation at that science policy practice interface? Clearly we failed. I mean, I think globally, the most powerful example of a science policy mechanism is the IPCC. And we're in a climate crisis. There's a failure. And yes, it can be about political will and all of that, but still, we need to say, can we do things differently? What works and doesn't work? Ultimately, this leads us to ask, how do we then, if we have answers to those kinds of questions, and each one of them comes with a set of sub-questions, but if we have answers to those, we need to ask ourselves, are our science systems enabling that kind of science? Are they enabling that kind of impact? And that leads finally to, are our policy and funding regimes still fit for purpose? And if not, how do we make them so? Those are the questions that I want to explore in the next 2 years as part of my new adventure here at Stellenbosch. Some thoughts, and I want to zoom in on the transformation, because I started thinking about this at Future Africa. And these are not, I'm not posing these as solutions, but just some thoughts of taking next steps, right? I mean, I could talk to you about, and we can in the discussion time, but we are running out of time, talk about other course corrections that other scientific communities are following. But I think here is something that's perhaps more relevant to our public squares project. Instead of talking about transdisciplinarity, can we talk about transformative research? And can we throw the whole toolbox at it? can we say, so at Future Africa, what we said is everyone's supposed to now do transdisciplinary research. What makes Future Africa unique, what's our niche, is we want to do research that supports and informs and supports processes of change towards sustainable development in Africa. And so we said transformative research in the first place has to be about equitable and inclusive collaboration. And that means not just having the right people around the table, representative from every sector or whatever. It means everyone has voice. It means everybody's perspective on the world counts. If you have scientists from different disciplines, their epistemologies and ontologies are seen as relevant and valid. Okay? Integrated research is the convening of disciplines that are relevant to the issue. And let me say that it's not about fun, when you talk transdisciplinarity to some people, they immediately get threatened about, but what about fundamental science? Transdisciplinarity goes beyond those old dichotomies. There can be fundamental curiosity-driven science that is highly relevant to the complex challenges, like knowledge, social science knowledge on political will, on the politics of sustainability, or on change, right? So integrated knowledge is just harvesting knowledge from wherever you need it. Engagement is the transdisciplinary issue, harvesting the relevant knowledge partners, bringing those together. It's about research that takes a systems perspective. It's about research that is at the forefront of the very powerful tools of the digital revolution, of AI, machine learning, etc. So digitally enabled. And then at Future Africa, we were experimenting with saying transformative research is also research that is futures literate. Now we could have another talk, and there's a futures literacy expert here at Stellenbosch. You should invite her. It's not about foresighting. It's not about scenario development. Futures literacy says we use the future all the time in planning today, but none of us regularly interrogate whether we are literate about future options. So we tend to have, if we're taking our current circumstances, our current assumptions about the world, and we tend to project those onto the future. So in futures literacy terms, they call that colonizing the future. And that means we are locked into pathways, institutional inertia. So futures literacy is a process whereby you try and expose amongst your transdisciplinary group each other's assumptions, your own and each other's assumptions, so that you know where people are coming from, and so that you can develop a joint, neutral vision of that future outcome you want, the change you want to see. Because that's where the contestation starts, is why are we doing this? What do we want as an outcome? And unless you clarify that, how effective can your project be? So futures literacy is a nice tool to begin that process, to clarify your objective, clarify the vision for the future in ways where you understand where people are coming from, essentially. And the nice thing we always say is no one owns the future, so it's a nice neutral topic to start with. So, why I'm sharing this with you, and all of this fits the open science paradigm, about which you can have another lecture, but it's within that. I mean, the open science paradigm that UNESCO has now also is championing through its 2021 recommendation, that's the report on it, is not just about open access to publication or to the public record of science. It's not only about data sharing, which is mostly what people think open science is about. The third dimension of open science is openness to society. And actually, I think there should be a fourth dimension, which is open institution. But anyway, transformative research fits and ticks those open science imperatives. And I think that's something we could think about developing. And then you have to ask, and this is really very rough first thoughts, you have to ask, okay, then what is transformative impact? And I think it's, for me, I did this just as an exercise for myself, is to say, we then need to think more about processes rather than, I mean, obviously, publications, all of that, right? But who's around the table? What are your principles of engagement? Who are your partners? What's their level of influence in terms of making change happen? Because you very often can have transdisciplinary groups where you're working with lovely people, but they can't necessarily make change happen. So, depending on the problem you're looking at, you might want decision makers around the table. So we need to look at those processes and how we're convening and who we're convening. And similarly, plot the modes of how we engage, not just with policy, but with public action. Have we got the right people? Have we got, are there innovative ways of engaging rather than writing the policy brief or having a close-out workshop for policymakers? We need to look at how we are integrating, sharing, and applying knowledge, and what are the power dynamics of that. And we need to look at how individual and institutional capacities and cultures might change as a result of the transdisciplinary project. So those are all sort of process-related things, right? And then, of course, we want to look at longer-term scalability issues, sustainability of the results of the knowledge produced, of that actionable knowledge. You won't be able to immediately measure whether it has made a change, but you want to get a measure of, is this potentially scalable, potentially sustainable, potentially leads to systems change. I think it's tough stuff, and I don't think we're there yet. I have not come across good MEL frameworks for transdisciplinary or let alone transformative research. I think there's a lot of work to be done, and on your basis of your experience, you should be contributing knowledge to how we do this. And that raises one of the challenges, is apart from, this, I think we're dealing with multidimensional theories of change, because you want to see change across different elements of your project. And we want to be reflexive also and look at how it's changed the dynamics, how it's changed your thinking about the research process, and how it's changed the orientation towards science of your partners. We have to think about the time frames. As I said, these two things are long-term, right? And you're not going to always have the time and the funding and the energy to do that. Attribution, always difficult. You might have to come up with custom indicators for your project. And I think we do need to look at what's out there in terms of really qualitative and more reflexive methods of looking at change. I think significant change method is interesting. It's all narrative-based, but it's very time-consuming. So that would have led me to your workshop. I hope that has been of some value and some interest, and I would love to keep engaging with the projects and helping to track where they go, what the experiences are, and maybe at some point we can have a workshop on how we monitor transformative research impact. Thanks very much.
Thank you.